Hello, welcome to Miss Rose's story time. As you see, Angus is already ready to listen to the story. We are going to be reading Bronze Bow, chapter 14. I hope you like, share, and subscribe to Miss Rose's story time. I hope you enjoyed the walk yesterday through the orchard and the bigger picture of why we're here. And your subscription to Miss Rose's Storytime would be very helpful. You can write me at P.O. Box 232, Old Swainsboro Road, Twin City, Georgia 30471. So we are in chapter 14, and it's titled 19 Guns. You can get this book at your local library or Amazon or things like that. You want to read 30 minutes every day. 20 minutes to stay the same, less than 20 to lessen your ability. So let's do 30 minutes every day. Okay, so 19 guns. David and his crew all died of fever. Heartsick, Nate hurried to Mary's house. All the way there, his thoughts were a jumble. What would he say to Mary? How would he comfort her? Maybe if I waited till after supper. To some of us, that is, let's see, in the north, we say breakfast, lunch, dinner. In the south, some people still say breakfast, dinner, supper. All right. He muttered. I could think of something to say, but he knew he was being a coward to tell himself that. He reached the house, tapped, and opened the door. Lois was there with Mary, helping Mary's little daughter read her New England primer. Mary saw Nate first. Nate! She came to meet him. Dear Nate. Here her lips trembled and her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, hiding her face. If it hadn't been for you, Nate, I wouldn't have married David. I know, Nate admitted miserably. He'd been thinking of that himself. Did Dr. Bentley tell you I wanted to see you? Yes, Mary. I came right away. I wanted to say thank you. Nate, if it hadn't been for you, I would have missed being the happiest woman in Salem. While David was here, she lifted her head. Her lips were steady now. She smiled slightly. Thank you, Nate. And now, will you do something for me? Anything I can. Sit down here and tell us all about your voyage, everything, just as David used to when he came home. 3 hours later, supper was over, the dishes washed, and Nate was still talking. Someone called, the door opened, and Elizabeth Boardman came in with her cousin, Mary Ingersoll, whom all the family called Polly. Elizabeth's violet eyes glowed. I heard you were here. Polly's level brown eyes danced with mischief. I think Elizabeth was just going to drop in to see Mary and pretend to be surprised when she saw you, but she was afraid I'd tell on her. Elizabeth blushed and laughed. Children, she said. Polly made a face. You're not so old, 16, and I'm almost. Elizabeth laughed with Polly. She said, tell us all about everything, Nate. So Nate was solemn. I couldn't possibly. It's taken me 3 hours to tell Mary and Lois. I haven't got them off Bourbon yet. Little girls shouldn't stay up that late. This time Polly made a face at him. When Father comes home, I stay up till all hours. Nate could imagine that. Polly's father was Captain Ingersoll, one of the most famous captains who sailed a derby ship. He told them about Bourbon and Captain Blanchard's Viva la Republique At 9, he walked to the Boardman house with them and then went to see Dr. Bentley. Dr. Bentley called late, bringing Nate up to date on the news of nations. Nate listened hungrily. He remembered how Hab had once said, "When I get home from a voyage, I feel as though I had been asleep 6 months." Affairs were in a miserable tangle, Dr. Bentley said. Things weren't settled with England yet. Americans were still fighting the Jay Treaty bitterly. English captains were still searching our vessels and seizing our sailors, and the trouble with France grew more serious every day. "I doubt if you'll be sailing soon again, Nate. At least not until the trouble with France is settled." But a few days later, Dr. Derby called Nate and Captain Prince to his office to talk over another voyage. "The ship is named the Astray." He smiled slightly. "I rather like that name." Nate thought of the earlier Astray on which Captain John Derby had brought the news of peace from Paris. He remembered how proud he'd been when his father said, "Crowded sail," he said, and came from Paris in 22 days. Mr. Derby seemed to be reading Nate's thoughts. "The other Astray made a record for herself. I intend that this Astray shall set a record too. The first Salem ship ever to enter Manila Harbor." Manila? Halfway around the world? Evidently, Nate decided Mr. Derby wasn't too concerned about the trouble with France. Mr. Derby went on in his quiet way. "The Astray mounts 19 guns, Captain Price. If any of your crew has ever shipped on a privateer or a letter of marquetship, they might be useful." Nate's scalp prickled. Captain Price merely nodded. "Any ports before Manila?" "Yes, you'll carry a mixed cargo to Lisbon and top at Funchal in the Madrian Islands. Then on to Manila." When Nate and Captain Price left the office, Nate said, "Manila, I wonder what language they talk there." "The Spanish are the..." Prince stared at Nate. "Don't tell me you're going to learn another language." "Why not, sir?" A few days later, Nate was ready to start learning Spanish. He had a dictionary, a grammar, and a New Testament. He opened the New Testament to the first chapter of John. Excuse me. Again, he repeated the words in English. "In the beginning was the Word." He looked at the Spanish. "En el principio era el verbo, y el verbo era con Dios, y el verbo era Dios." Nate smiled. Spanish, he decided, would be the easiest language of all to learn. He could figure out every word in the sentence without a bit of trouble. Toward the last of March, Mary said, "Do you have to sail Friday, Nate?" Nate teased her. You're not superstitious about Friday, are you? Saturday's your birthday. If you do have to sail Friday, I wish... Nate saw the idea back of Mary's eyes. "Oh, no. You don't tell anyone that Saturday is my birthday." "Why not?" "I wouldn't care for a celebration on shipboard." "Why? What would they do?" "Oh, something jolly, like dunking me, or pouring a few buckets of water on me. No celebrations, please." Mary promised she'd keep his birthday a dark secret. Nate kissed her and went down to the wharf to see how the loading of the Astray was coming along. Mr. Collins was on board and in a foul humor. "You and your teaching," he growled. "What's wrong with my teaching? We've lost 4 of the men we were counting on, including Keeler." Nate grinned. "Keeler was supposed to be a troublemaker, wasn't he? I think you'd be relieved." "He was," Collins growled. "But Keeler knew guns. Blast you and your teaching. 4 good men, all signed up as second mates on smaller vessels." "Good for them." Collins glared. "What about us?" "We'll just have to replace them." "Sure, just like that. And do you know who is going to replace Keeler?" "Lem Harvey." Nate whistled. He knew Lem Harvey, a huge fellow with hulking shoulders and a sullen, swarthy face. A troublemaker if ever one lived. "Why sign him on?" "Because," Collins growled, "he sailed on privateers before he was knee-high to a capstan. He knows guns. If we have trouble with the French, he'll be worth the rest of the crew put together." "And if we don't have trouble with the French?" Nate asked. "We'll have trouble with Lem." "Personally, I'd rather have trouble with the French." A boy came aboard with a letter for Nate. "Dear Nate, good luck on your voyage. When the Astray sails, I'm going to be on the captain's walk, watching you, Elizabeth." Early Friday morning, Nate strolled across the common toward the big white house and saw Elizabeth standing on the captain's walk. She waved and signaled that she'd come down. A few moments later, she came outside to meet him. "You're shivering," Nate said. "You're cold." "I'm not cold," she whispered. "I'm scared." Her violet eyes looked bigger than ever in her heart-shaped face. "Nate, they have guns on Astray." "Why?" "Just so we won't have any trouble. It's a French privateer. If a French privateer sees us, we'll look so dangerous that the privateer will crowd sail and run." Elizabeth didn't smile. "Nate, please take care of yourself. If anything..." Suddenly she stood on tiptoe, kissed him, wheeled, and fled into the house. Nate stared after her. He started to follow. He stopped. "Nonsense," he told himself. "She's just a child. Get on board your ship, Mr. Bowditch." He strode briskly towards the waterfront. Somehow, he didn't quite know how it happened. He found himself on Union Wharf instead of Derby and had to pretend he was looking for someone. Once Astray had weighed anchor, though, he forgot about everything behind him. He even forgot about 16-year-olds who did unexpected things, such as kissing a man goodbye. For the wind was against them. If the Astray managed to beat out of the Salem harbor, every man on board was going to need 4 arms and 6 pairs of hands to handle sail. The men worked desperately to keep her far enough into the wind to clear Naugus Head, but they couldn't make it. They had to come to and anchor again. All day Friday and Friday night they stood their watches and slept with their ears cocked. All day Saturday and all that night and all Sunday morning they waited. It was late Sunday afternoon before they finally got underway. They again divided the men into watches. When Nate had the first choice, he heard himself say, "Lem Harvey," and then wondered why he did it. Was it because he felt responsible for Lem's being on the Astray? When the watches were divided, Captain Price stood on the quarterdeck and spoke to the crew. If anything, he sounded grimmer than he had sounded on the Henry. He added something to what he had said then. There are two things every man of you must learn, and learn fast. First, you learn to recognize the colors of every nation. When you're on lookout and you sight a sail, you'll take it for granted it's an enemy until you know it's a friend. Second, you must learn to handle these guns like the crew of a man-of-war. Lem Harvey, I'm putting you in charge of training the crew on the guns. I want these men drilled until they can cast loose their guns, run them out and fire. He snapped his fingers. Like that. Do you understand? Lem Harvey didn't smile, or straightened, or show any pleasure. He scowled, his heavy black brows coming together over his sullen eyes. Aye, aye, sir. They'll learn. That was all he said aloud, but Nate saw his mouth finish a sentence. They'll learn, or they'll wish they had. Day after day, Nate heard Lem roar his orders and bellow his abuse. Between spats of profanity, the directions were exact. Cast loose your guns. No, you thumble-fingered fool. Make the muzzle lashing fast to the eye bolt. Level your guns. How many times do I have to tell you? Lash that bad to the bolts. Take your tumble pinions. You blasted fool, don't stand there and hold it. Drop it. What you think that lanyard's for? Run out your guns. You, look at those tackle falls. What sort of lubber coil is that? It fakes, I told you. It fakes and fakes. Prime, get that powder horn out of the way. Serve you right if you let you stand there till it blew up in your face. Move. Point your guns. No. First with your side sights and then with your upper sights. You there, ready with that match? Fire! And the guns roared. Before the sound died and the smoke lifted, Lem was bellowing again. Sponge your guns! Is that sponge? Ram it down! Ram it home! Twist it! You want to leave a spark in there to blow you up? Ready with that cartridge? What are you doing? Sleeping on your feet? Load! Get that wad in there, you fool! Ram it home! Ram it! Shut your guns! Day after day, Lem bullied and jeered and crushed the men. But they learned to handle the guns. They finally moved fast enough to please even Captain Price. But Lem still bullied them. When the men weren't drilling on the guns, they were slaving in the riggings. Nate was glad for the crew when they sighted the coast of Portugal. They stood off and on all night. In the morning, a pilot came on board to take them up the Tagus River. When they sailed through the mile-wide mouth of the river, and then saw Tigris spread into a great bay. On the north bank of the river, the city of Lisbon rose on the hills. Nate stared at the houses. He'd never seen anything like them, tile-roofed and painted every color of the rainbow. Mr. Collins drawled, Well, Mr. Bowditch, did you learn Portuguese talk too? So you could be handy in port? Nate said, Blast! I didn't think of that. I've been learning Spanish from Manila. But when Nate and Captain Price went on shore, they found that the custom officials conducted all their business in French. Again, Captain Price clapped on his hand on Nate's shoulder and said, We don't need an interpreter. Soon Nate was busy changing exodus to dollars and adding figures in the head before the other men could add them on paper. Between times, he went sightseeing in Lisbon. It is true, figuring figures in your head is faster than a calculator. You just have to learn them. I must remember all this, he thought, to tell Elizabeth when he felt his cheeks get hot. To tell all of them, I mean. But it was Elizabeth's face and her sparkling eyes he could see when he thought of home. He drew rough sketches of things he wanted to remember. The tawny oxen that looked so fierce, with their 6-foot spread of horns. The amazing women of Portugal who carried everything on their heads, boxes, baskets, and huge flat trays of fish. He tried to sketch the streets of Lisbon, but he couldn't get the effect he wanted on flat paper. I'll tell them, he thought, that no matter where I wanted to go, it was always uphill from where I'd been. He could imagine how Elizabeth's eyes would sparkle when he get back. He said, and he stopped. Before they got back, the Astrea would have sailed halfway around the world. Lisbon might seem far from Salem now, but it was next door to home, compared to far-off Manila. He found an old sailor who had doubled the Cape and been in India and through Sunda Strait to Manila. With the help of a map, gestures, Spanish, and figures, Nate managed to learn a lot. Things went quickly in Lisbon, but not quickly enough to keep Lem from slipping ashore when he was on duty, getting into a fight, and landing in jail. He was put in the brig until the Astrea was ready to sail. The morning they were to weigh anchor, he was released. Yeah, having good character, integrity, honesty, humility, those are very important. It's nice to know things and to be, smart and educated and everything, but if you don't have good character, all of that is no use. So, character is important also. A storm howled in from the Atlantic, and for a week they waited out miserable days and nights. Lem tried to slip ashore again and sat out the rest of the storm in the brig. After a week, they managed to beat out of the Tigris into the Atlantic. Then they battled headwinds to Madria. Lem was released from the brig again. They needed his weight on the halyards. At last, they anchored in Funchal Bay. The storm had ended. The moon rose, and they saw the whitewashed houses rising on steep hills, gleaming in the moonlight. When Captain Price and Nate went ashore, the first man to greet them was Mr. Pintard, the American consul. He hailed them like long-lost brothers, asked news of home, and invited them to dinner, all in one breath. Mr. Pintard was all smiles, too. When they dined in the Pintard home, she was full of stories of the islands. Mr. Bowditch, she said, have you heard the delightful legend of how Machio got its name? There were 2 lovers. Mr. Pintard smiled. My dear, Mr. Bowditch is a mathematician, not well, he'd hardly be interested in your legends. A mathematician? Then here's an interesting problem for you, Mr. Bowditch. 5 years ago, I inherited some money in Ireland. She named the amount. Mr. Pintard said, dear, wait until after dinner, and, let Mr. Bowditch write down. Nate said, and what happened? The money was invested in Ireland at 8%, she told him. After 3 years, the whole sum, interest and all, was sent to England. It was invested there at 8.5%. After 2 years, let me see. Yes, 2 years and 2 months, the whole sum was sent to me here. How much should I have received? Mr. Pintard said, "After dinner, dear, you can write down the whole thing for him, and he can take it home and work it out. We don't want him to waste his evening over figures, do we?" Nate laid down his knife and fork and sat staring at the flickering lights of the candles. After a little he said, 843 pounds, 15 shillings, and 6 1/4 pence. "Tell me about Machio." Mrs. Pintard stared. Mr. Pintard said, "What?" "Machio," Nate replied. "I'd like to hear how it got its name." Captain Price grinned. 2 minutes by my watch. He won't have to waste the evening after all." "But that's right," Mrs. Pintard gasped. "To the last fraction. That's exactly how much I received." "Of course," Nate told her. "That's the beauty of mathematics. It's exact. Now about Machio." Mrs. Pintard was still staring at him, dumbfounded. "You've no idea how handy he is in port," Captain Price was amused. Mr. Pintard shook his head slowly. Then he said, "I guess I'll have to tell you the legend. My wife is too dumbfounded to talk. But about Machio, it was this way. It seems there were 2 lovers, Robert Mitchum and Anna de Freffret. Some sort of Romeo and Juliet mix-up between their families, I suppose. Anyhow, they were fleeing from England to France. Their ship was caught in a storm and driven clear to Madras. The place they were driven ashore was named Machio after them. I never heard whether they lived happily ever after or were wrecked, but that's the legend." Nate said, "Thank you. I'll tell her about it when He felt his ears getting red. "My sister, I mean. She always interested to hear about everything." Mrs. Pintard was still dazed. The last fraction of... Then, woman-like, she must have noticed Nate's flush. Her eyes danced. "Mr. Bowditch, you're sure it's your sister?" "Are you trying to arrange a romance for my supercargo?" Captain Prince asked. Nate laughed with them. He knew he might as well. A fine chance he have to make a girl fall in love with him. What was it Liza said to him once? "You mathematician, I wish you could at least pay compliments without arithmetic." All right, that's the end of chapter 14. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like, share, and subscribe. I hope you have a good rest of the week, and we will talk to you again next time when we have story time. Say bye, Angus. There he is.